October 25th, 1944. The waters off the coast of Samar Island in the Philippines are calm, completely silent. But that's exactly where things get interesting. A small, vulnerable American task unit, codenamed Taffy 3, is patrolling the area. They believe the main Japanese fleet is hundreds of miles away, defeated, retreating. But here's the kicker. They were dead wrong. Through a catastrophic breakdown in Allied communications, Admiral William Halsey had taken the main American Third Fleet north, chasing a Japanese bait force. Mark this down. He left the entire landing zone. Thousands of American soldiers on the beaches of Leyte, completely unprotected. The only thing standing between the brutal Imperial Japanese Navy and a total massacre was Taffy 3. Now, let's look at what Taffy 3 actually was. Pay close attention to this. It wasn't a glorious battle fleet. It was a collection of 6 small, slow, unarmored escort carriers, nicknamed jeep carriers, protected by only 3 destroyers, and 4 even smaller destroyer escorts. And it gets even crazier. These ships were never meant for real naval combat. Their hulls were made of thin steel, so thin that the sailors openly called them tin cans. You could literally puncture the side of these ships with a heavy machine gun. Their job was simple: protect supply lines and stay out of trouble. But at 6:43 a.m., the morning mist suddenly cleared, and that is where the magic happens. American lookouts looked over the horizon, and their blood ran cold. Rising from the sea were the massive, towering pagoda mass of the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force. Listen closely to this. It was the most powerful surface fleet Japan had assembled since Pearl Harbor. 4 massive battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers, moving fast, directly toward them. But here is the real nightmare. Leading that terrifying armada was the Yamato, the largest, heaviest, most heavily armed battleship ever constructed in human history. A single armor-piercing shell from the Yamato's giant 18-inch guns weighed as much as an entire American jeep carrier. The Japanese commander, Admiral Kurita, looked through his binoculars and smiled. He thought he had trapped the main American fleet. He ordered his ships to open fire. And this is where things get really intense. Giant shells, the size of automobiles, started raining down from the sky, turning the ocean around Taffy 3 into a boiling cauldron of colored geysers. The tiny American carriers, moving at a pathetic top speed of just 17 knots, began fleeing into a nearby rain squall, launching every single aircraft they had, even planes carrying nothing but small anti-submarine bombs, or no ammunition at all. But they knew, deep down, that running away was completely useless. The Japanese heavy cruisers were twice as fast, closing the distance every single minute. But then, the ultimate twist happened. Instead of panicking, instead of striking their flags and surrendering to an unstoppable enemy, the Americans did something that completely defied logic. Think about this for a second. The commander of the destroyer USS Johnston, a half-Cherokee officer named Ernest Evans, looked at the massive Japanese armada and decided to attack. Without waiting for orders, Captain Evans turned his fragile, unarmored tin can completely around. He ordered his crew to increase speed to flank, pushing the Johnston to a screaming 36 knots, charging directly into the path of the entire Japanese fleet, alone. And that's exactly where the pride of America takes over. A single lone destroyer, fighting against 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers. As the Johnston accelerated, it began zigzagging through the massive enemy shells, firing its small 5-inch guns relentlessly, hitting the massive Japanese heavy cruisers like a small dog biting a giant bear. But here is the best part of the story. Evans wasn't trying to survive. He was trying to buy time. He was throwing his ship into the jaws of death so that the rest of Taffy 3 might live. And as the Johnston disappeared into the thick black smoke, the rest of the American destroyers looked through the haze and decided they wouldn't let the Johnston fight alone. And that is exactly when the greatest, most heroic, and most insane naval battle in history truly exploded. The ocean was tearing apart, and the sheer desperation of the moment was absolute. But that's exactly where things get interesting as the USS Johnston charged into the jaws of the Imperial Japanese Navy alone, under a hail of giant shells. The commander of Taffy 3, Admiral Clifton Sprague, made a radical decision. He ordered his remaining destroyers to lay down a massive, impenetrable smokescreen and launch a full-scale torpedo attack. But here's the kicker. These tiny ships were essentially committing suicide to buy just a few more minutes of life for the helpless carriers behind them. Every single American destroyer, the Hull, the Heermann, and a tiny, lightly armed destroyer escort called the Samuel B. Roberts, turned directly into the enemy fire. Mark this down. They began pumping out thick, black, chemical smoke from their funnels, while their engines screamed at maximum capacity. The sky over Samar turned pitch black, blinding the sophisticated optical rangefinders of the Japanese battleships.
Now, let's look at the sheer madness of this charge. Pay close attention to this. The USS Johnston, already battered by Japanese shells, managed to close the distance to just 10,000 yards from the Japanese heavy cruisers. Captain Evans gave the order, and a spread of 10 torpedoes tore through the water. And it gets even crazier. One of those torpedoes struck the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, completely blowing off its bow, forcing the Japanese flagship to withdraw from the battle line. The tiny tin can had just crippled a giant. But the Japanese retaliated with absolute fury, and that is where the magic happens. 3 massive 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo ripped through the Johnston's thin steel plating, tearing into the engine room, cutting her speed in half, and destroying her steering compass. The bridge was reduced to a bloody ruin. Captain Evans was badly wounded, losing several fingers on his hand. Listen closely to this. Instead of retreating to the sickbay, Evans wrapped a bloody handkerchief around his hand, walked down to the aft steering column, and continued shouting steering orders directly down the hatch to the sailors below, manually turning the rudder. Meanwhile, the other American destroyers were creating a complete hellscape in the smoke. The USS Hoel charged the battleship Congo, dodging shells that could have vaporized her in a single second. She fired her torpedoes, forcing the giant Japanese battleships to turn away, disrupting their entire attack formation. But notice the sacrifice here. The Hoel was hit over 40 times by enemy fire, her hull turning into a steel sieve, yet her gunners kept firing their small 5-inch guns until the ocean literally swallowed the ship. And then, the tiny Samuel B. Roberts stepped onto the stage. Think about this for a second. The Sammy B was a destroyer escort, a ship even smaller than a standard destroyer, meant only to protect merchant convoys from submarines. She had only 2 5-inch guns and carried very few torpedoes. Her maximum speed was a pathetic 24 knots. But here is the real kicker. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Robert Copeland, keyed the ship's intercom and told his crew the brutal truth. They were going into a fight against heavy cruisers, and survival was unlikely. And that's exactly where the pride of America takes over. Every single man stood at his post. The Sammy B accelerated, pushing her engines so hard they bypassed all safety limits, reaching an incredible 28 knots. She emerged from the thick black smoke just thousands of yards away from the Japanese heavy cruiser Chikai and opened fire. Listen to the intensity of this moment. The crew of the Sammy B worked with such robotic, patriotic speed that they were loading and firing their guns faster than the automated training manuals said was physically possible. For over an hour, this single, microscopic ship traded punches with giant Japanese cruisers, firing hundreds of shells, setting the Chokai's superstructure on fire. The Japanese gunners were completely bewildered. They couldn't understand what they were looking at. But here is the ultimate twist. Because the American ships were charging with such terrifying, relentless aggression, and because the sky was completely filled with thick black smoke and chaotic torpedo tracks, the Japanese commander, Admiral Kurita, made a massive, fatal mistake. He looked through the haze, saw the relentless speed of the American destroyers, saw the swarms of American aircraft attacking from above, and came to a shocking conclusion. Pay close attention to this. Kurita believed he wasn't fighting a few weak, unarmored escort carriers, and tin cans. He genuinely believed he had stumbled into Admiral Halsey's main, massive Third Fleet. He thought he was trading shots with heavy cruisers and fleet carriers. The aggressive, uncompromising spirit of Detroit and the American sailors had completely warped the reality of the battlefield. They had turned a total ambush into a psychological nightmare for the Japanese High Command. But the ammunition was running out. The American ships were sinking, and the final brutal climax of the battle was about to begin.